I am really excited that we are going to let on the stage, once I can figure that out, Carlos Martinez. So let me just bring him up here. Hello, I think you are on.
We're
Hi,
live. How are you doing? Hey, Sara, ¿cómo está você?
Hi, Carlos. It's very nice to have you here. Hola, buenas tardes.
Good to see you guys.
I feel very inferior because we have multilinguists in the house right now. And I only really know English and a bit of Chinese, a little bit. Okay. But shifting over to why we have you here, Carlos, we have you here to help us understand everything that happened. Well, not everything, because we don't have 5 hours. But the recent Trump and Xi Jinping meeting in South Korea, what that tells us about geopolitics in general and the difference between the US and China. But again, to just introduce Carlos Martinez is a researcher, political activist from the UK, and author of the book, The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. He is a co-founder and co-editor of Friends of Socialist China and co-founder of No Cold War. Welcome, Carlos.
Hey, guys. Honored to be on with you. Your first live guest.
Yes, you are.
Amazing. Thank you so much for wading into these uncharted waters with us. So just to start, actually, Sarah, do you want to start?
No, I would like you to start first. Well, okay, I will start. So Chinese president, I don't know how to speak it in English. Xi, how do you say it?
You can say Xi.
Xi Jinping, I will say how we do it here, met with President Donald Trump in Busan. Trump said it was amazing. He's a good friend. It's a 12 out of 10. All those hyperbolic, emotional, I don't know the depth of it. But in any case, it was now in South Korea on the 3rd of October and was the first meeting between the two leaders since Trump returned to office. Can you give us an overall takeaways from this meeting which by most accounts has been reported as positive? Is it positive? And what is the difference between what was in display between the US and the Chinese leadership, how they displayed differently, they commented differently? So your overall opinion, both of them.
Yeah. I think I'm kind of cautiously optimistic and positive about the whole thing. And the consensus seems to be reading analysis pretty much across the board, in the Western mainstream media, in the financial press, the Financial Times, and then the Guardian and New York Times, and going up, and then including Chinese media and political analysis on the left. I think the consensus is basically that while all the issues weren't necessarily resolved, and we haven't, sadly, brought an end to the tariff war altogether, there is at least some kind of truce. And what you've really got is essentially a return to the status quo ante, what you had before Trump launched this tariff war earlier this year. So, the US has agreed to reduce its tariffs. I don't think we've got the exact figures on that, but they've massively de-escalated their import tariffs on Chinese goods.
The only figure so far, right, is like 47%.
Right.
10%. It's a 10% from 47.
From 57. Yeah. From 57 to 47, but I don't know what the Chinese side are doing.
Yeah, so the highest it reached was 145% a few months back, and then Trump had been threatening the reimposition of 100% tariffs. But anyway, so not 100% sure what the figures are now, but they're much lower, and obviously China will reciprocate with similar level of reduced tariffs. China's paused its restrictions on rare earth exports for 1 year. It seems that some of the restrictions on US exports of semiconductors are going to be lifted, at least temporarily. And China said that it will restart buying US soybeans hopefully, Sara, that doesn't cause a problem for the Brazilian economy, because I think Brazilian agribusiness has been the big winner in this whole.
I would love to stop exporting soya because it destroys one of the major biomass, which is the Cerrado. Sorry to interrupt.
Right. But essentially, as I say, we're back where things were before Trump started off this tariff war. And the US administration has got essentially nothing of what it was aiming to achieve. It was trying to force major concessions from China. It was trying to impose essentially, an unequal treaty on China, the sort of thing that was imposed on China between 1840 and 1949, during the Century of Humiliation, under which China would buy trillions of dollars worth of US products that it doesn't need, and that China would give the US tariff-free access to its markets while accepting US tariffs on Chinese goods, and while accepting, a deepening of this US semiconductor war that was initiated by Biden and that's been deepened by Trump, the idea of which is to strangle China's technological development and to prevent it from becoming sort of a technological superpower, if you will. So, and that's a really important part of all of this is the semiconductor and the modern technology, digital technology side of things, because really the only areas, US manufacturing has more or less disappeared over the last 40, 50 years. The only areas where the US economy is still competitive in like industry and in terms of the production of actual physical things is high-end computing and, of course, the military-industrial complex. So the US has been looking for ways to retain that lead in the digital economy by suppressing China's development, using these illegal means of unilateral sanctions and export controls, essentially using a Tonya Harding approach to economic competition, and to bypass the fact that actually China's economic system and Chinese socialism is proving its superiority. And, it was more than 40 years ago that Chinese then paramount leader Deng Xiaoping said that the superiority of the socialist system is demonstrated by faster and greater development of the productive forces than under the capitalist system. And we're really seeing that now. China is going far out in front on so many areas of the economy, whilst the US is slowing down and is stagnating, much like the rest of the West. So
why do you think on the rare earth, which would be break down the entire supply chain for the military, the US, why do you think China agreed and put a pause on that policy?
So first things, just to clarify for the audience what the significance of rare earths is. Rare earth metals are very important components in a pretty vast array of modern technologies, including smartphones, including batteries, including electric vehicles, also medical equipment, MRI machines and stuff like that. And also, of course, famously, military materials, fighter jets, precision missiles, etc. And China completely dominates this whole global rare earths market. It represents, I think, 80% to 90% of processing capacity, highly efficient supply chain, very strong in processing and in refining. That whole process of refinement has got a very, very high technical threshold. And China's been working on that for decades, right? No other country comes close in terms of its capacity for production, its capacity for refining, and in terms of its economies of scale, like its cost effectiveness. So that's sort of the context, just in case it's helpful. And China introduced these export restrictions, which were not an export ban, but restrictions aimed at, in line with China's international obligations around weapons proliferation, aimed at upholding its international obligations, essentially as a countermeasure to the US tariffs and to the US export controls on semiconductors. So, of course, every reasonable person, the three of us, all peace-loving people in the world, would be very happy if those restrictions would just carry on forever. But from China's point of view, China would actually like to end the tariff war, as soon as possible. Like the tariff war wasn't China's choice, and they've always been very clear. We don't want a tariff war, but we're not afraid of it. We'll fight it. We're not going to accept unequal treaties being imposed upon us, but we would like to negotiate, and we would like to come to a mutually agreeable arrangement that works for both sides, and that works for the whole world, and that feeds into the stability of the global economy. So I think in a context where the US is offering some concessions, and the US is offering to reduce its tariffs and is offering to reduce its export controls on semiconductors, I think it would be difficult for China to justify continuing with those export controls. And I don't think the US would give those concessions if China didn't also make concessions. That essentially that's been used as leverage to bring Donald Trump to the negotiating table in the first place. And plus, it could be considered as a unilateral sanction, which, as you know, is not actually legal under international law. So much as we would all like to see the immediate universal dismantling of the military-industrial complex, I think it has to be seen within the context of this tariff war, and China's playing its cards.
Right, and I think it's worth saying that the reason why they were so the export controls were so, I think, somewhat surprising to the U.S. side was that they mirrored the semiconductor sanctions that the U.S. put on China. I mean, ironically, the U.S. is like that. They will do something, and then they'll be shocked if no one else can do the equal thing. But basically, the semiconductor, the thing about it that's significant is the secondary sanctions that are embedded into the controls, which, China did with the rare earth minerals. And like you said rightly, that I was very hopeful about, maybe naively, because like you said, it's part, they haven't been untangled just yet. And also, I think the other thing to clarify is that there were two export license restrictions that were announced this year. The first one being the April 2025 ones, which also had dual use export license restrictions. Now that is the license restrictions that is really alarming the US, because the dual use export license, that is the one that deals with military weaponry, etc. And that's the one that would be greatly restricted. So there were some that were announced in April, and there were some that were announced in October 9th. But the postponement of 1 year is only for October 9th, right? So can you help us understand what this actually means in real terms, or as much as you can?
I'm not an expert on rare earths or the export controls. But what it seems to me is a sort of managed and reciprocal climb down, and the whole thing really demonstrates the differences in overall orientation between the two sides when it comes to this whole conflict. If you look at what Xi Jinping said in the press conference after the meeting, he said that the whole world is confronted with these many tough problems, and that our two countries, China and the US, can jointly shoulder our responsibility as major countries and work together to accomplish more great and concrete things for the good of our two countries and the whole world, right? So these are very much the words and the sentiments of a statesperson. He said, we've got no intention to challenge or supplant anyone. Our focus is on, and has always been on, managing China's own affairs well, improving ourselves and sharing development opportunities with all countries across the world. So he's presenting this very kind of measured, reasonable approach, which is just such a clear contrast to the US's aggression and its confrontation, its recklessness. And the message is getting through, and I think it's really disrupting the other aspect of this tariff war, which from the US's point of view was to just bully other countries into siding with the US against China. Actually, because of China's reason and its measured response, countries around the world see China as a responsible partner that's interested in mutual benefit, that's interested in respect for sovereignty, that pursues non-interference, that pursues shared development and common prosperity, and the easing of rare earth restrictions is part of that, because it shows that China's not it's not a reckless power. It's not kind of, it positions itself very much within international law, within the principles of the United Nations Charter, and that acts in a responsible way. And the result of that is that even countries that have traditionally been in the US orbit, are increasingly more attracted towards working closely with China. Look at India. I think the New York Times said a couple of months ago that Trump is pushing India back towards China. The US has put incredible effort into driving a wedge between those countries, right? But now you had, at the end of August, Narendra Modi going to China for the first time in 7 years for the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Tianjin. Direct flights have been resumed between China and India for the first time in many years. Even Canada is kind of making approaches towards China now to improve the trade relationship. The ASEAN countries, obviously there was the APEC summit around the fringes of which Trump and Xi Jinping had their meeting. The APEC summit agreed, an upgraded regional free trade agreement with China. So China's been playing this very patient game. It's been described in a couple of articles recently as in Gramscian terms, as a war of position. And, it's succeeding. It's continuing to strengthen its relationships with the other countries of the world, including, by the way, in the context of a tariff war, giving tariff-free access, complete tariff-free access on every single product line to all least developed countries, including, I think, 32 or 33 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It still maintains a large trade surplus, running at around the rate of $1 trillion a year, even though it's exporting much less to the US than it has been doing. And it's been able to do that through years and years of diversifying its trade relationships and its supply chains. It's making progress on its own semiconductors. The whole idea of semiconductor export controls from the US was to prevent China's rise as a technological and digital superpower. Actually, all they've done, and this is so often the effect of sanctions, is to kind of foment a renewed drive within China itself to develop its own domestic semiconductor industry, which is proving very successful. China's economy is still growing, at a rate of 5% per year, far higher than any major Western economy. Wages are rising rapidly. People are living increasingly well. If you've gone to China, you'll see the infrastructure is like light years ahead of the United States. So, all in all, I think, as I said, China doesn't want a tariff war, but it's been able to weather this storm extremely well. And what the summit between Xi and Trump represents is, more than anything, a climb down by the US.
I think that's a really good
Carlos,
point.
China is often viewed.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Ileana, go ahead.
No, go
I have a
ahead.
delay.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I'm having a delay here, so we're stumbling of each other. But you wanted to comment. I'll ask my question after that.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just going to say it's a really good point that you're making there, Carlos, about the emphasis on international law, because again, that is definitely something that Western media uses against China to say like, oh, well, China doesn't care about international law, it doesn't care about any laws, that type of thing. And like Xi Jinping has mentioned the UN Charter, has mentioned international law in almost every major announcement down, the Global Governance Initiative, the Global AI Plan, Action Plan. I mean, all this references the UN and international law. So I think that's a really good point as to why they won't, even though we want it. It's like, it's easy to want, like, we want an easy fix. We want an easy solution. Stop the US empire. Stop it now. Go, China, go. But the fact of the matter is they're very conscious too. They're not going to do this like short-term thinking. They're thinking long-term. what is the world going to look like in a multilateral sense? If they just did that, what happens to the world order? It's like, it's disrupted. So yeah, thank you for that. I didn't think about it properly. So thanks, Carlos. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, so Carlos, China is often viewed as either imperialist power to the US, or then it's seen a passive bystander, not doing enough, stop Israeli, US, British genocide in Palestine, or is not doing enough to help Venezuela against the US. It's very difficult for outsiders to understand China's foreign policy. It's really difficult to grasp. It's almost invisible moves. I don't know. So I want you to talk about that, how to explain this to us. And also, if you can talk about the forthcoming compilation from Friends of Socialist China, China Changes Everything.
Yeah, sure. This is it's a quite interesting narrative because, China is kind of getting more visibility, and I think it's increasingly attractive, and people are increasingly interested in what's going on in China. And as a result of China's objective progress, and also the fact that people have got a bit more exposure to China, more people are visiting China, influencers are visiting China, people using the red notes, Xiaohongshu, and things like that. And as a result of that, having some sort of grassroots people-to-people engagement with Chinese people, and they're seeing, the amazing infrastructure in Chongqing or in Shanghai or whatever. And they're seeing what China's doing in relation to renewable energy, which is very difficult to hide. At a point where a single country is responsible for 50% of all renewable energy production in the world, then that's something that's pretty interesting, right? But so that's a positive thing. But people, some people have sort of jumped from that, saying, "Oh, China's doing interesting things," to basically assuming that China can just rule the world in a benevolent way, and just that it's got access to a magic wand that it can solve humanity's problems, which it kind of doesn't, right?
Oh no!
And he's freezing.
Oh, sorry.
You're back.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, China is not a hegemon. China doesn't have a plan to become a hegemon. Doesn't have the ability to become a hegemon, and we kind of need to incorporate this small matter of material reality. China doesn't actually have the ability to project its power globally in the way that the United States does, right? The United States has got its 800 military bases, it's got its military alliances, its NATO and its AUKUS and its quadrilateral security dialogue. It's got its deployment of tens of thousands of weapons around the world. It's got its deployment of tens of thousands of troops around the world. So China, doesn't have that means of power projection that it can just,
solve these. China doing more against the genocide. Shouldn't they be doing more?
Right. Well, I'm coming to that. China's foreign policy is very, very strongly based on, the principles of the UN Charter, as we've talked about, on international law, on the principle of respect for sovereignty, non-interference, mutual benefit, and global, sustainable development, all the things that are kind of built into international law, which the US and its allies willfully ignore. That's kind of the importance of international law and the importance of the UN and the Charter, is that, all of these, the UN system isn't perfect, but the world would be a much better and a peaceful and a more prosperous place if the imperialist countries actually worked within that framework. China can't send troops to Gaza. Now, controversially, China doesn't impose sanctions on Israel. And that's something a lot of people complain about. And I think, in many senses, it's a legitimate complaint. It's not within my gift to determine China's foreign policy, but, it does have a very good, reason. It does have a very good rationale and justification for not imposing unilateral sanctions on Israel, because unilateral sanctions are illegal, right? For a sanction to be legal, it has to run through the United Nations Security Council. And if China imposed unilateral sanctions on Israel, it wouldn't be justified. It wouldn't have a justification for opposing the US and Europe's and Canadian and Australian unilateral sanctions on Cuba or on Venezuela or on Iran or on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or Nicaragua or Zimbabwe or Eritrea, etc., etc. Unfortunately, I could go on. So in terms of what China has done materially for Gaza, which I think is limited in terms of its scope of operation and action, but it has from the very beginning called for, demanded at the UN General Assembly and Security Council an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire and an immediate and comprehensive withdrawal by Israel from Gaza. It's in terms of developing the Palestinian National Project and developing Palestinian national unity. It brought the 14 biggest Palestinian factions together in Beijing last year, including Fatah, including Hamas, including Palestinian Islamic Jihad, including the PFLP and the DFLP. It brought them together in Beijing, producing a Beijing Declaration, which is about kind of a united post-war governance in Gaza, which was actually a very important contribution. It's interesting that it's only China that's able to do that. China maintains very good relations with all the resistance factions, and it's saying, on the basis of its own experience, China's own experience, and the experience of the Communist Party of China, you're not going to achieve anything. You're never going to have stability, and you're never going to win your legitimate national rights if you don't have the highest possible level of unity. So that's actually an important material contribution. Chinese representatives have spoken out at the International Court of Justice in support of the right of colonized peoples to armed resistance against occupation, which in many ways is quite a bold thing to do. And meanwhile, and this is like Ileana, you and I were talking about.
In the UK, you can get arrested for that, right? In the UK, if you claim that, in the UK or the US, if you claim, like for our Asian and Brazilian audience, if in the UK, in the US, if you claim that colonized people, according to UN Charter, have the right to resist, including armed, you can be charged as a.
There's a certain.
Yeah.
We definitely can't say anything about Hamas here in the UK at all. So, yeah. But yeah, just as for disclaimer for people to know, watching as well, that is actually a real thing.
This is really big that China takes this stand, that China sits down with I think it's 12 resistance group, at least that I know of, in Palestine, and acknowledge their right to resist. In the UK, you can get charged not by any law, but by the terrorist law. We have a friend, Richard Medhurst, who is being investigated and indicted in 2 different countries here in Europe, UK and US. And we know many others which the anti-terrorist police entered journalist homes in the UK, raided them. Sarah Wilkinson, they dropped the ashes of her mom on the floor and seized her phone, seized her passport, pretended didn't seize her passport, which would be an offense not to hand it in. So in the UK, we have a war on terror on people that speak for Palestinian right to resist. Just a brief disclaimer for our audience. So it's big. This is big what China is doing in our perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, very true, and full solidarity with Richard Medhurst, full solidarity with Sarah Wilkinson, and everyone else that's been targeted. Literally hundreds and hundreds of predominantly older people, pensioners, who've been arrested for holding up signs saying we oppose genocide, we oppose, we support Palestine action. This is an unbelievable and pretty unprecedented level of repression in a supposedly democratic country. But yes, the other thing I just wanted to quickly say about the whole China and Gaza dynamic, and Ileana, you and I have discussed this briefly in relation to Danny Haifeng's article, which we republished on the Friends of Socialist China website a couple of days ago. There's an element of kind of like diversion there, because like we're projecting the problem onto China, whereas in reality, it's the Western countries and particularly the US that's responsible for all of this. The Israel is essentially a proxy of US imperial interests. The US provides something like 60 or 70% of Israel's arms, of the actual weapons that are being used to kill, tens of thousands of innocent people in Gaza. With Britain not very far behind, with Italy not very far behind. So it's our countries that have actually got the power to put a stop to this, disgraceful, disgusting injustice and massacre. The onus should be on these countries, and our focus as progressive and decent human beings that support national liberation in the West should be on opposing our own governments and forcing them to change track. And just you asked me about the book China Changes Everything as well, which I think has just been released a few days ago. Basically, Friends of Socialist China has a US committee as of about a year ago, and that committee's taken the initiative to put together this compiled volume about Chinese socialism, China's foreign policy, the new Cold War, China's role in an emerging multipolar world order, and so on. And that's got chapters from Gerald Horne, Pavel Vargan, Margaret Kimberley, Jackie Lukman, Radhika Desai, KJ No, Ken Hammond, Dee Knight, myself, Keith Bennett, Kyle Farana, and several other people. So have a look online. I think you can get the PDF, and you can buy a physical copy.
Okay, so I will track down that link, and I'll put it under in the description of this clip. Thank you, Carlos. I want to read it, so I'm excited about that. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that overview. Some more things to think about, I think, for people. Oh, I did want to ask you one more question. I know we're running so long. Of course, it's our first live. Do you have time for one more question, Carlos?
Sure.
Okay, sorry about that. So this is it's because I'm Malaysian too, not to be so like I said, egocentric, like we were talking about the Americans. But, Trump boasted of 2 trade deals, when he went to Asia, apparently the longest trip to Asia in his return to the White House, 6 days. And he boasted that he made trade deals with Malaysia and Cambodia. Obviously, I'm Malaysian, so I really want to know about that, because Malaysia had a trade deal with China as well, I think a few days after at the APEC. So could you kind of talk us through that, or what do you think about it? I'm personally worried about how much economic coercion is being exerted over Malaysia, because Malaysia, like most Southeast Asian countries, has to really balance this tightrope of, what would be in their self-interest would be to work with China, but they have to also appease the US. So could you help us break that down a little bit?
Sure. I mean, to be honest, you've said most of what needed to be said. But yeah, so the US announced that Malaysia's going to get rid of, or at least reduce, tariffs on pretty much all US products. And it's also, they've said that Malaysia will recognize US regulatory oversight. So, the US can export its agricultural products, say, don't worry, this stuff is safe, you don't have to regulate it, and Malaysia will accept that. Similar deal with Cambodia in terms of eliminating tariffs and agreeing to exclusive US regulatory oversight. The Malaysians have said that they'll buy, I think it's $3 billion worth annually of US liquid natural gas, which is an ecological absurdity, right? Malaysia and the United States are not very far away, and we're talking about a fossil fuel which is produced through hydraulic fracturing, or commonly known as fracking. They're drilling up to a mile below ground, releasing tons of methane, which is a much, much stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is, into the atmosphere. And then they liquefy this gas, this shale gas. To liquefy it, you have to cool it to minus 100 degrees centigrade, and then you put it on container ships and take it across the Pacific Ocean. So it's actually, it's a crazy thing to do. A crazy way for Malaysia to meet its energy needs in an era where we should all be going, renewable energy, and cooperating with China around renewable energy production is just such an obvious. It's a much more cost-effective and a much more environmentally friendly option. But anyway, I think
Petronas as well. We have a national. We have Petronas. It's like we have oil, so it's also confusing. Okay, but go ahead.
Yeah, but I mean, these are multi-year agreements that have been made with Petronas. Malaysia's even agreed to buy US coal, which is which is a whole different level.
That doesn't sound good for us at all.
No, it doesn't sound great. And then there's a memorandum of understanding around rare earths. So the US is trying to diversify its suppliers of rare earths. And they announced a deal with Australia recently that they're going to up their investment in Australia rare earth metals, and now they want to do that with Malaysia as well. I mean, Malaysia may have decent supplies of rare earths, but the issue with rare earths isn't just finding those raw materials, isn't just like getting some metals from under the ground, but it's purifying them and it's processing them, which, as I said earlier, has got an extremely high technical threshold. And China's really, China's been working on it for a long time. It's the only one that can do that. Any other country is going to be minimum 20 years behind. So you can have all the deals with Malaysia and Australia you like. You're not actually going to solve your problems. And that continues to be a significant lever that China's got. What does Malaysia get in return? What does Cambodia get in return? They get a reduction on the tariffs. So I think it's down to 19% in both cases. And you have to remember, at the end of the day, both of these countries are really feeling the pain of the trade war. Not every country can do what China does. China's a massive country. China's the largest trading partner of about 3/4 of the countries in the world, right? Or at least 2/3 of the countries in the world. So China can diversify its trading partner. Okay, the US has imposed 100% tariffs on us. We'll just export whatever we need to export to any of the other 150 countries that we've got extremely good trading relationships with. And we don't want to buy US soybeans, we'll buy Brazilian soybeans, et cetera, et cetera. So China has got levers that not every country can pull. And Malaysia and Cambodia, along with Mexico and Canada and other countries, they're really, they're on the front line of this whole trade war. They don't have the same capacity as China. So it was kind of to be expected, I think, that they would be willing to make some sort of concessions in order to regain access to the US market, which is still, in spite of whatever stagnation in the US economy, the US is still, I think, far and away the largest kind of high-end consumer market. It's a very important market. So as you said, Ileana, Malaysia and Cambodia as well are both, they don't want to be part of a new Cold War. They don't want to take sides. They don't want to engage in bloc politics. Both try very hard to maintain good relations with the US and with the West and with China and with Russia. And they're certainly not about to sacrifice their relations with China. Malaysia and Cambodia are both part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. They're both working on, enormous infrastructure projects together. Both countries are politically close to China. So, I wouldn't worry too much about the fact that they've made some concessions. I don't think they have a choice about making concessions. That's unfortunate situation that's been brought about by the recklessness of moribund and declining US capitalism. And as Gramsci put it, the old world is dying and the new world is yet to be born, and now is the time of monsters. Well, now is the time of monsters. And
I'm going to be polemic now. If I think the garages that people have in the US full of stuff, they must buy a whole lot. They must be part of a huge market, even if they are dying empire. The amount, the consumerism, how this society is structuring the consumerism, and I think this is part of the problem, why they need to produce so much as well, because it's insatiable. If you see the hoarders in America, at least in TVs, what we get, like TV shows on people hoarding things, and even the average American having 2-3 garages to put things that they cannot live without, but they don't use them. So I think when you have a society that is so focused on this type of activities, how do you feel this emptiness? You don't. And then I think I would say this is one of the problems here in this equation. And that's why they need to buy so much. They need to get someone, let's go to Malaysia, let's go to Brazil. We need to have a cup of coffee in Starbucks. This is this size. And the can of milk is this size. Can we just not consume less and leave others alone?
Capitalism. That is the problem with capitalism.
Yeah. Well, it's important to recognize that there is a significant layer of the working class in the United States which doesn't live a nice consumer lifestyle, especially among minority and oppressed communities, which live in increasingly global South conditions. And then this whole consumerism mania has really been built on the back of debt, for one thing, and then offshoring neoliberal globalization, and the debt bubble is really bursting. That was never going to be sustainable, and we're seeing the results of that now. And the whole neoliberal globalization and financialization and this whole structure of the modern capitalist economy it's run out of roads. We're in a pretty serious and chronic long-term economic crisis of overproduction, of productivity, profitability, and the US ruling class doesn't, and the Western ruling class in general don't have answers to that. There's no solutions to this problem, and that's why they're hitting out in such kind of reckless ways and aggressive ways. That's why we're seeing the level of conflict that we're seeing, crazy activities like an unwinnable war in Ukraine against Russia, or a genocide in Gaza, or this tariff war, or new Cold War, and this escalation of encirclement and containment against China. So, China's rising, the global South is rising, we're moving towards a multipolar era, but it's not going to be an easy journey.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that, Carlos. And thank you for giving so much of your time to our first ever live.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.